Okay, hi everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality. Welcome to the webinar, Surviving the Talent Drain, Using Survey Data to Predict Turnover. I'd like to take a moment to introduce both the topic and the speaker today. First, the topic in terms of measuring and predicting turnover. This is something that's been done for a very long time, where people will gaze upon survey data and intently stare at the numbers and try to make predictions about where in the organization are we at risk and how much is that risk, and try to say what do we have to do to reduce the chances of a turnover. I can remember myself, probably 25 years ago or so, for one large chemical company putting right on the cover of the survey, because they're worried their managers wouldn't open the results. We put on the cover, based on the pattern of the data inside, we predict your turnover for the next 12 months will be X. You want to know why? Look inside. And so there's been a continuing sort of feeling about the importance of being able to measure turnover, potential turnover, and to predict turnover for years and years and years. And so today we're seeing sort of another cycle of what's being called the sort of the great blocking on the word, where people are quitting left and right, and it's hard to attract and retain employees. And so Scott and I thought we'd put together a webinar where we're really looking at how has this been done historically, and how do you look into your survey data to make some predictions about turnover in your organization, and how do you know what to do about it, if anything can be done about it. So our speaker today is Scott Brooks. Scott is a PhD in IO psychology. He's also a fellow at the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists. Scott always, every time I hear him on a topic, he always comes up with new insights, expanding on conventional wisdom or enhancing conventional wisdom. So it's always a pleasure to listen to him on virtually any topic. And insights will be gained. I think you'll gain additional insights out of his presentation today as well. Before I turn it over to Scott, just a few housekeeping kind of things. We will be sending out copies of the slides today at the conclusion. And please, at the end of the webinar, take a moment to complete our survey. Also, at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, you should see a little box that says Q&A. And during the webinar, we'll be monitoring that. And should you have any questions you'd like to ask, we will hopefully have time left at the end, and we will try and answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. So with that, and without any further delay, let me turn it over to Scott. Scott, welcome.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here with you. This is actually taking me back, this topic. My master's thesis actually was explicitly on employee turnover and some of the theories at the time and so forth. But today, what I have for you is some approaches to how to address and measure turnover and manage it, some examples and some cases, some other nuggets, and then what I feel is an extraordinarily useful model that helps frame some of these things up and gives you a way to think about this that might be a little different. And what are we in? As Jeff was alluding to, we're in the middle of what some have been called the Great Resignation. And you just do a fast Google, in half a second, you get over 500,000 Google hits. And just some examples from that first page, you get Fast Company, BBC, NPR, and so forth. And all this is kind of amazing because really it only started spiking in May. You see the Google Trends graph on the side. So you ask the question, is Great Resignation, is this a thing? Yeah, it is, but it might be a little different than some of the hype that you see. For example, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics says that in July this year compared to July last year, quits are up 0.4%. Now, less than 0.5% isn't exactly match the hype of what has been talking about, but it is almost triple that in some industries, and so there is something there. Now, what's the tone of almost all of these articles and blogs, and what's the message that you hear about? Well, this is what people say, disengaged people quit. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that this common wisdom is so true that it will distract you that it's only part of the story. There's a lot more going on here. So first I'm going to show you a little bit more of a complete model. There is a decision to leave that employees engage in. It's really a combination of three forces. There's the push, right? The dissatisfaction, disengagement, something I don't like about my current employer or a job or context. There is friction, switching costs. What does it take for me really to pull stakes and leave and get a new job? And then there's the pull. Where am I going? What's the alternative? Now, this is a simple model, but it has some important implications, not just for measurement, but for action and for addressing all this. So let's walk through some of these things individually. So the push. What is the push? Well, the push is probably pretty clear to most of you. It's the urge to leave one's job. It's the internal environment. What's happening inside an organization and how are you responding to that? Who's at risk? Well, the disengaged, the unfulfilled, the alienated. And I suspect, given a look at the roster of webinar registrants here, that you all know this pretty well. Now, this is also generally thought to be more controllable, so it often becomes the focus of retention efforts. And it is definitely the focus of most media discussions that are out there. But it's a mistake to stop here. It's a mistake to interpret the Great Resignation based solely on the push and the dissatisfaction. Well, let me skip to the other side for a second. What is the pull? The pull is the attraction to another alternative. I quit and I'm going to do something. And they were talking about something in the external environment to the organization. It's not necessarily another job. Very importantly, I might be going back to school. In fact, grad school enrollments are up this year versus last year and the pre-pandemic years. But I might also be going to do other things. I might be pregnant with twins, which was literally a quote from an exit survey I'd done a while back. Or I might be giving Etsy a go, trying to do something a little bit more aligned with some passions I have. So what are the conditions of risk for pull? Well, better, smarter employees tend to be the ones that get poached. Better educated, more trained employees can find other jobs often more quickly and more easily. You have more pull when there's more jobs available. And certainly the economy in not just the United States, but the entire planet has been undergoing some major shifts over the past year. And with some kind of like the toilet paper supply chain, the job supply chain has been going through some resetting. But there's also, if I have other acceptable non-job alternatives, if I don't need money, for example, I can go do whatever I want. There are personal family demands, of course. Part-time workers typically have more pull options than others. Now, the pull is often the least part of retention efforts because there's a knee-jerk reaction that this is out of our control. It's the external environment, and so there's nothing we can do about it. But you can think about it this way. Yeah, the weather's outside of my control too, but that doesn't mean that I don't prepare for it. I don't put on a jacket. I don't bring an umbrella, or I don't change plans when stormy weather's coming up. And this is also related to the great reevaluation and where jobs are. The Great Resignation is one frame that's been put on what's happening. The Great Reevaluation is another. This is kind of related to the shock model of turnover that's out there in some academic literature, where there is an event or a triggering situation that causes people to reevaluate their priorities and what they want out of a job or out of an employment situation. I'm pregnant with twins is a great one, or I just got diagnosed with cancer, or you know what, I've decided that I really want to do an Etsy site and become a craftsperson. All of these things are reevaluating what your priorities are. Interestingly enough, just like after 9/11 here in the United States, in the pandemic, marriage proposals have seemed to have spiked. Maybe not weddings themselves, but marriage proposals. That's a great example of people stepping back, thinking about what's important to them and making a big life decision. But there's a lot of macro level forces at play here due to the pandemic, and we'll touch on some of those as we go. So third, what's the friction? Switching costs. These are forces that make it harder to quit and reduce turnover, right? So when does this happen? What are conditions of higher friction and therefore more retention? Well, comp and benefits tied to years of service, like vesting in a 401k. Being geographically bound, if I'm in a place where there are no other jobs, I might not leave. Short-term dependence on a paycheck make it harder for me to quit. Emotional investment I have in my current situation. Full-time workers, much more invested than part-time workers. You might have wondered at some point, why is it that part-time workers can be more favorable on employee survey results and yet quit more often? This is it. They have less friction. They're less invested. They have other alternatives and so forth. But also, this is sort of a moderate focus of retention programs. A lot of times, those kinds of retention programs based on friction come out of comp and benefits, like bonuses, year-end bonuses paid at one particular time of the year. People don't quit until that payout is made. Or vesting in 401ks and other kinds of things. Pensions, on-site childcare, great thing, but also a huge amount of friction. Regardless of what I feel about my job or other alternatives, if I've got young kids and on-site childcare, I don't want to move. But one of the things that's new here is the I can work from anywhere thought that has emerged from so much remote working. Really reduces friction. Commutes, working with friends, being out of state, all those things are no longer barriers. They're no longer switching costs to what's happening. So we step back from all of this and we say, well, what's the big question? You know, why are people quitting? That's what we want to answer. But a bigger question is, what can we do about it? And so really we want to focus here on turnover management, not just turnover prediction. Now, I'm a scientist at heart, and I get deeply involved in dealing with questions, these kinds of questions. So let's probe a little bit. Here's an exchange from an actual client. Said, you know what, we need a better exit survey. Turnover's increasing, and in key job categories and people that we definitely don't want to leave. All right, let's frame up the questions. Now let's think about this for a minute. Typical frame for an exit survey, you're asking a question basically around why are you leaving? That's great. A more refined frame, and those of you with some research backgrounds or stat geeks on the line, you will know that this is potentially a question more refined. What can be done months ahead of time to prevent regrettable quits? All right, that starts to suggest some different ways you collect data and different ways you act on data. So how can we address these questions? Two things we're going to focus on: exit surveys and census surveys. I'm using the term census surveys. You might call them an employee survey, an engagement survey. Pulsing can certainly do this, but just for distinction from exit surveys, calling them census surveys today. So let's start with exit surveys. Here's some basic measurement advice. The first thing is, beyond known retention drivers that you might stick in a survey, you know, how's your career, how's your pay, how's your everything, ask about the decision process. So let's walk that kind of advice through the push, friction, and pull model. So with push, what can you get at in exit surveys? Well, you can certainly get at known retention drivers. You can ask questions like, if a couple of things have been resolved, I would have continued to work here, or I'd work for this organization again. Those all surround the push. You know, why is it that I'm leaving this current place? And what is it about the place? But you can also ask about friction, and this is often overlooked. Was it hard to leave? What will you miss the most? What are some of the things that you had to organize in order to make your decision to quit? All of those things are very important and really help round out your story. And then you can also ask about the pull. Did you actively look for another job? Was a new job easy to find, or will it be? What kind of job or role are you moving into? These kinds of things help round out your exit survey to cover all three of these forces. Just a couple of other call outs about exit surveys. There is a limitation. You're inherently retrospective. You're asking people when they're quitting, how they feel about that, and you're asking, you're getting what's top of mind. Also, this works best when you are able to compare some of the responses, at least with stayers. So how do you feel about your career? You want to be able to compare that to people who are actually staying so you can track the gap. And importantly, and I've alluded to this already, the exit survey is the best opportunity to ask about the friction and the pull and track those over time. Let me give a quick case. There was many years ago, I was doing exit survey with a sales group in a global organization. Year one, there was no real strong push. The exit scores on things like career and manager and recognition and so forth kind of matched the overall organization scores. But we also asked about the pull. A lot of people were going back to school. The pregnant with twins example came from this particular case. I can remember one person was going to divinity school, something very different than what they were going into. So the pull was to a different type of situation. Year two, what happened? Well, not only was the turnover rate up, but the push increased. The gap of the leavers versus stayers started to separate. And actually, internally, even stayers started to feel a little bit worse about pride and other kinds of organizational attachment. And in asking about the pull, there were many more people moving towards competitors, a better job in the same kind of scene, but at a competitor. So this is the kind of thing that tracking exit surveys can tell you. Let me move away from this briefly to get into census survey kinds of issues and how you might work through some of those measurement decisions. Clearly, census survey focused on the internal environment. It's asking a lot of people, typically everybody in the organization, about how do you feel. And the push is really well covered in census surveys. You get into work-life balance, you get into values, you get into leadership, you get into everything typically in these kinds of surveys. Now, the friction and the pull, typically these kinds of surveys don't dig into those issues. Sure, it's possible. It's less common. You can cover these with special items or supplements or special projects. But for now, let's assume that they're not really attached to the existing surveys that you all might have. But one thing that census surveys do often have is some sort of intention to stay or intention to quit as an overall indicator of turnover risk. Let me dig into that for a second. So you can say, all right, asking, hey, I'm seriously considering leaving the organization or something else. Is that really valuable? And the answer is, oh yeah. It is a great proxy for actual turnover. And in fact, the research is very clear. Any item asking about staying or leaving directly will be a fair proxy for actual turnover. And it will nearly always be the item most related to actual turnover. So, said differently, if you want to predict turnover, don't just look at your overall engagement metric. Look at a single item, if you've got it, that is asking about, are you going to stay or are you going to quit? Let me give you an example. So one client had, I rarely think about looking for another job in another company. We matched that up a year later with people that actually quit and that everybody that stayed. Stayers were at 63% favorable on that item, and those that quit voluntarily were at 38%. So maybe not quite half the green, but pretty darn close to double the red. And in fact, the quitting unfolded over the course of the year since the survey was administered. And 1/3 of the people who did quit told us about it in the prior year's survey. So that might not look like a lot, but there's a lot of statistical traction here. Did everybody say, yeah, I'm going to quit? No. Does everybody know it a year ahead of time they were going to quit? No. But there is a lot here that gives us the grit to develop a story. And one of the things is that it helps us quantify what risk looks like. So you have an item like this, a favorable score in the 30s, that's bad. 1/3 red, that's a 1.5 to 2 times what the stayers might show. that helps you figure out, what is a risk profile looking like. So working from an item like this, in this case, a different kind of intention to quit, let me give you an example of how you could drill into that, even if you don't connect it to actual quits. So here's another organization, not considering leaving in the next 12 months. 10% were unfavorable, not bad, but we could drill into that. And so here you can see that looking at some different segmentations, one division was 3 times the risk of the others. And that, as we saw from the other one, when you get into your 30s, that's a pretty big deal. Now you can develop these different kinds of segmentation breakouts. This is not all the divisions. It's not all the functions or all the facilities, but it's the ones where the risk spikes a bit above the overall. And you can either just do a quick sort to find those, or you can do fancier kinds of analyses like shade. That's a separate topic. I don't want to get into shade. I'd be here for another 2 hours. But once you've got something like this spec'd out, you can also then drill into the issues and do various kinds of key drivers of intentions to stay, right? And in this particular case, you could see it's goals, and I trust leadership, and manager eliminates barriers, and also I can work through high workload periods in order to plan around them. Now, you can work through that, and that makes a nice narrative for this organization. It's like, where am I going, and how do I live through the work that's happening now? But that's a narrative unique to that organization. It does echo some of the common themes, particularly the top 2 ones. When we were looking at an evaluation of key drivers across about 1 million employees, we've got some commonalities. First, career comes up as a driver 21% of the time. I can grow here, I'm satisfied with my opportunities, all those kinds of things, that's under career. The second most common driver was something about leadership, and I'm not talking about my manager, I'm talking about senior leadership. Trust, confidence, communication. And there's evidence to suggest that this one is even more important in the pandemic, because it's the leaders that are steering the boat. They are making the decisions about furloughs, about layoffs, about hiring, about strategies that help the organization grow and survive or not, about what helps me work from home if I've grown accustomed to that or not. That's where a lot of things come from. And you want to make sure that they have your values at heart, which actually takes us to the next one, which is values. Another one that's been on the rise over the past decade. Ethics, principles, well-being. Does the organization echo what I find important? And then the work itself never fully goes away. I like the work. It gives me purpose. It's got meaning for me. Now, one of the things that this list says, if I've got 5 drivers, odds are that one is career related, right? So I got 1 out of 5 drivers are career. I do want to emphasize a critical point, though, which is that common drivers don't mean most important for you. Each unique analysis for an organization, and some that you've done, might include nuance that's relevant for you. Other drivers with other organizations include safety or innovation or workload, as we saw in the prior example, or quality. What is it that's really important at that place at that time? And that's easy to do with drivers. But if you've got the wherewithal, and you could do a little bit more with survey analysis, and you got a little bit of time to do it, there's something else you can do rather than just key drivers within your current survey results. You can take your census survey and you can add to it subsequent turnover data, and you can therefore address the question, what at time 1, at time of the survey, tells us why people might quit later on, right? Which is really the question we want to do. We want to know not why are people quitting in the moment, but what can we manage right now that might prevent that? And so the basic visual of that is we got survey administration. I say year 1, it could be month 1, it could be quarter 1, kind of depends on how long it takes for you to accumulate a pile of terminations in the meantime. And then you can create a database. And this ideal data set will link non-anonymous survey responses to individual voluntary resignations, enabling a predictive model. And that was actually what was done a few slides back when I was comparing and showing you how intention to quit was different for stayers than leavers, right? And you get to calibrate that. But you can go further and you can drill into pockets of things. Like what do people in different pockets of turnover look like? One quick case of connecting survey to future quits. Here's the top items that were most related to future quits. The number one, always, intention to stay. Current employees in this particular case were at 80% favorable a year before all the quitting unfolded. Those that wound up leaving voluntarily over the subsequent year were closer to 50%. 27% gap. Now, we didn't just identify this item based on gaps. We did a lot of advanced statistics, but the gap is always handy to help calibrate what's going on. But if we were to look here, we see some other items, and these were identified via some of these special analyses, different regression models, and some other kinds of things, as key actionable indicators of actual quitting. And you can bundle these together to become a turnover risk index and help track the issues that are most related, in fact, to future quits. And all of these scores, they're, some of them are already high. Some of them are a little bit lower. So you don't necessarily want to work on what's highest or lowest, but what's potent here. And in this case, we see some of the common things about career goals. We see, promising future, I want to be here. Confidence in the company's future. It's a little bit related to confidence in leadership, right? So where are we going, and is that a place where I want to be? So I've talked a lot about different ways to sort of stare at results and do things. I want to move from the numbers themselves to thinking about action, right? And I want to run through a quick list of things that help define teeing up action. So, teeing up action. First of all, zero turnover should never be the goal. We hate it when people break up with us. We don't like it when people quit. But at the same time, we want to recognize A, zero turnover is not achievable. B, there is functional turnover. It is true that the more folks you have for a longer period of time, the more expensive your workforce gets, right? And so also it might deny new ideas. It might deny the ability to enhance evenness and equity and equality and inclusion and so forth. And so instead of turnover minimization, really we want to talk about turnover management. So that's point number one. Second, as alluded to with some of these other things, risk can be measured and targeted. You can find the pockets of risk, like an example a couple slides back, the places, the segments where high over turnover risk exists, and then you can determine that as a focus. Now, is that in geographic place in your organization? Is that in a functional place? Is that certain characteristics of people like high performers or something different by gender or ethnicity or something like that? But once you've got those pockets, then you can address the issues or the drivers or the scores of those pockets that might be inspired by different analyses you've done to really focus on what are the most important levers, the issues that are related to quitting. Kind of related to this theme here is that not all turnover is equal. Certainly some turnover is a higher cost than others, right? IT jobs, potentially higher performers or unique skill sets, higher levels of managers. Those might be more expensive literally to replace. But you can also think about recruitment difficulty. Recruiting into restaurants these days can be pretty hard. We probably all encountered areas where staffing seems to be a problem in some of the services we consume. So not just higher costs per body, but what are the costs of the organizations? And importantly here, is there a loss of capability, regardless of the monetary structures in all of this? What is the loss of capability? If I just don't have a front desk worker in some sort of position, I can't process things and I can't have the customers flow through. So there's like low capability there. Or if I have a scientist on staff who departs, I lose some capabilities that that individual might have represented. But once we've sort of got our focus, what you want to do is create assignments for managers, leaders, and HR. And clearly, all of these assignments might be different. What a manager can do versus an executive, different kinds of things. And clearly, and I don't want to belabor this point too much, but if I am trying to address turnover in the restaurant industry, that would be different than government, right? And so the assignments that people might have can be a little different. I will leave you with some tips. So, you know, don't fear that I'm trying to say, well, it all depends. But assignments for different groups is utterly important, and assignments for different layers of people is critical. And these efforts that you give people should focus across the push, the pull, and the friction. For example, you might say, well, what can a manager do about the pull? You know, you might have heard of something called a stay interview, right? Which is, yeah, hey, you know, if you were to leave, what would you be looking for, and how can you get that here? That is a great way to talk about the pull with employees, and that's a fair thing to do. But overall, your goal is to build and maintain organizational competence. And in this, we want to consider turnover as a flow of people, not a series of individual events. I know we don't like it when people break up with us, and any given, you know, turnover or quit can be very painful. But in the end, you know, especially when we're looking at survey results, we want to be looking at the bird's eye view of an organization and how is flow coming in and out of the organization. Some of you I know are in retail or call centers or other kinds of situations where there's just a regular flow of people coming through the doors. And so how do you make costs lower? How do you manage the flow? That's not always just keeping people. It might be how do you make it easier to have people come up to speed? What do you do when some important person departs, and so forth? And so all of that will be part of a management program. And also backup plans that you develop for when somebody quits, you know, the cross training or systematizing some people's information and so forth like that, what they know. But, you know, I mentioned that some of the specific approaches to action will be different depending on your issues. DEI issues might focus differently than problems related to overall organizational stability, right? But I'm not going to let you go without divulging a secret. That's how to cheat. So one thing you can do is, let's say you're a manager, you get your own survey results, and like Jeff said, it might talk about turnover risk and so forth and what your turnover is likely to be. If you want to cheat and you want to improve those survey results, here's what you do. 2 months before the survey is coming on to administration, sit down with each direct report that you've got and give them sort of an honest evaluation of their performance and how they contribute to the organization overall. 1 month prior to the survey administration, sit down with each of your direct reports again, ask them, hey, where do you want to go in this organization? And ask them how you can help them get there. You know, what do they like? Where do they want to go? What are their ambitions? That's how you cheat on your survey results. And so you will notice that if you do these things, your survey results will magically be better. So this is the kind of thing that, yes, it will increase retention. Yes, it is cheating of a sort, but yeah, cheating is what we want managers to do. If it drives these great conversations, then that's all what we're here to create with surveys. If it helps create a stronger bond and a stronger dialogue between different groups of people, that's what surveys are supposed to do. That's how you cheat. I want to start wrapping up, and I know this is a pretty quick ditty of a webinar, but as a summary, do what you can, but know what you're doing. We talked about exit surveys and census surveys and kind of divided census surveys up into 2 different questions that they help answer, right? So exit surveys are, why do people say they quit? Census surveys are, what drives thinking about quitting? And that's when you're looking at key drivers themselves, right? So content analysis within one particular survey administration. But if you can link that to future quits, you can ask a more sophisticated question of what predicts future quits. And if you think about the push, pull, and the friction model, each of these is a little bit better at doing different kinds of things. Not everybody can just pull an exit survey out. That's fine. But think about where you're going to get information about friction and pull. Not everybody can connect their census survey to actual quits, maybe a year later or a month later. So, do key drivers. So there's a lot you can do, but just make sure you step back and you know what questions you're really answering, and then, do your best, give it a shot. And whatever your mix of things, definitely balance all three forces here, the push, the friction, and the pull. Because if all you do is spend time thinking about engagement and disengagement and so forth, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on. Particularly with the pandemic forces, remote work, furloughs, uncertainty about future stability of a business, all kinds of things like that. So with that, I know that pumped through a lot of things fairly efficiently. I want to see if there's any questions and open up the remaining time we've got to see if anybody has any questions they want to ask. Happy to dive in.
We've got a number of good questions here, but also let me say, just as a reminder, a promotional thing, if you go to if you want to know more about this, want to read more about what you can do, we have an ebook on our website. You can go to our website, download the ebook for free, and get a nice little read that goes into more detail on some of these topics. But I have a number of questions, Scott. First one, if you think about exit surveys, are the results any different between administering an exit survey as someone's leaving versus a few months after they've left?
Yeah, there might be, but overall, exit surveys are the kind of thing where you get good information regardless. And I hate to be too practical instead of purist sometimes, but you administer an exit survey when you can. That's the basic answer. Do things change a little bit? Maybe, but the broad tone of the story you're going to find is pretty consistent.
Well, I'd also imagine that as someone has gone longer and longer, finding them may be harder and harder.
Exactly. That's where the practicality comes into play. I know this wasn't in your question, but if I can answer sort of another thing, it's like, well, what's the difference between exit surveys and exit interviews, right? One of the things that surveys give us is standardized data to compare to other things, to compare over time, and also importantly, to compare to stayers. If you're just chat with somebody, say, hey, while you're quitting, you might come up with the two most common things would be pay and maybe my manager. Because those are the easiest things to talk about. But when you actually look at data, people don't diss their managers as often as we all think they do. And pay, maybe a lot of people aren't as satisfied with pay and think about they could do something better. So the structured predictive data emphasizes some of the things we've been talking about here, like career or leadership or values or things like that. And the structured predictive data is less about strictly pay. It could be a factor for sure, but average, typical, most common, no, pay is not part of that mix.
Yeah, I've always seen that once people feel they're paid fairly, it tends to drop off as a driver of engagement or satisfaction.
Yep.
If you think of the model, Scott, of the push-pull and the friction, is one of those have more weight than the other, or would you say they're all three equally important in terms of turnover?
I mean, I hate to be all consultancy, but it depends. If unemployment skyrockets, right? And this is one of the things we actually saw during the initial days of the pandemic. People didn't want to quit. because of the external environment. They weren't sure what exactly was going on. They didn't know if they would have a job. Life was so stressful, you didn't want to add, other kinds of things. What is that? That life is so stressful? That's kind of friction. It's like, I just can't pull stakes right now. Or if there were no jobs out there, then the pull is going to be, the top factor. But in a completely, frictionless case where there's lots of jobs out there and I can work anywhere because I can be remote, then maybe the push becomes a bigger factor, right? It's like what induces me to leave an organization. But it all depends, it depends on the situation. You got to read them. They're always all worth considering, but the relative importance of them could change. And we've been seeing some of that on a planetary scale.
In the last couple of weeks, you've seen in the news that both Walmart and Amazon, covering millions of employees, are now doing tuition reimbursement for those who and other perks like that with respect to college expenses. Yeah. Would you define that as increasing friction?
I would. Yeah, that's perfect, because it doesn't really change my work environment per se. It might give me a little bit of a boost in my sense of career possibilities, but really it's like I'm sticking around, through school or whatever is the terms of that particular thing, that particular benefit. I'm sticking around in order to get it. I know some places, if they give you tuition reimbursement, they want you to stick around for at least a couple of years after you get your degree, right? So, is that fair? Is that locking you in? It's like, well, kind of, yeah, but it's an eyes open deal, right? If it's worth it to you, then that's awesome.
Used to be called the golden handcuffs, right? But I haven't seen that referred that way too much recently. Mm-hmm. Here's one question. This one's a little long. Let me read it. With predictive modeling, some models can provide feature importance scores, which shows how important particular variables are to the model. I'm something like stepwise regression, I guess. Have you ever correlated these feature importance scores to your risk evaluation work? In other words, can these feature importance results be turned into interventions?
Yeah, for sure. Whether it's regression weights or relative weights analysis or something like that. I mean, what you're trying to do is figure out, of all of the sort of variables that you've got, which are typically survey items, which ones are most important for what you want to do. And so, you might find that, something is recognition or something about safety, right? Which is more important, recognition or safety for a particular environment? It's like, well, different kind of feature weights can help you get there. And they might take you in very different directions, but, you want to sort of figure out, what's more important and what's actionable, what can you address? So, sure.
Let me ask you a question of something that happened to me once. I'm wondering how you'd fit it into the model. Again, many, many years ago, we did a exit interview study of nurses. And this was an organization that they were losing well over 10,000 nurses a year. So a very big healthcare kind of entity. And the number one reason they gave for why they left was that no one asked them to stay. In other words, no one asked them, why are you leaving? And we'd love to take care of that and ask you to stay. And they said, fully a third of them said, if someone had asked me to stay, I would have. How does that fit into the push friction pull model?
Well, it's kind of the they've got a little push to nudge out of the organization, and the process of exiting, right? There was nothing in that. Nobody asked them to stay. Nobody said, oh, you're going to be missed. And it just sort of validated their impulse to leave. And so, I think that one of the things in that little case study about exit surveys I told you about, the global sales force, there was a question in there, which was, hey, if a couple of things could be fixed, would you stay? And in year one, the answer was, nah, I'm pregnant with twins. There's not a lot you can do about it. In year two, it was like, yeah, you know what? If I had just had a better conversation or something like that with somebody in the organization and so forth. But how people exit is a touch point, right? It's a moment that matters. And probably in a lot of the organizations represented by the, you all in the audience here, you've got a lot of boomerangers, people that come back. And so exiting with grace and sort of saying, hey, what would it take to have you stay? That's a fantastic thing to include in that process. Turnover management is not just about keeping people, it's like having the exits with grace.
Yep. Okay. Well, I would like to thank everybody, and remember, we are going to send you a copy of the slides. So you'll be getting that from us shortly. And if you'd like more information on this topic, download the ebook from our website. There's no cost associated with that. And please, as you exit, take our survey on whether or not this was worthwhile. Was it too long, too short, et cetera, et cetera. We try to modify our webinars based on your feedback. Any closing words, Scott?
Yeah, I think, again, being a data guy, I would emphasize something here. If we were all in person, I would say, all right, show of hands. Who quit their last job because of their boss? And any room you ask that in, most people say, no, really wasn't that. And what this comes back to is this common wisdom that people join organizations but leave bosses. Manager, as like just the manager, him or herself, that's almost never a driver of quitting. That's almost never a full-on factor or influencer in predicting actual quits. Sometimes what a boss does, like has a career conversation with me, or maybe recognition is there, but it's recognition, it's not the boss. But most of the time, and if we were all here in person, I'd ask for that show of hands, and you'd look around and you'd see that most people aren't raising their hands. So I encourage you to do that next time you're in a situation where somebody says, hey, we all know that the boss is why people leave. And it's like, that's just not true. And you can prove it on the spot with something like that.
I actually
do
that.
That's where.
No, I was going to say, I actually do that with my MBA students when I have a class, and almost no one ever raises their hand.
Right,
but
right.
I'd say, are there horrible bosses out there? Yes. Do people quit because of those horrible bosses? Yes. But when you look at the statistics, they're a distinct minority. They're just not driving the data. So, well, thank you, Scott. I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. And thanks, everybody, for coming. See you soon.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.